During most of the 20th century, the U.S. copyright law required at least one copy of every American film to be disposed at the Library of Congress at the time of copyright registration, but the Library of Congress was not required to retain copies under the prohibitions of the Act of March 4, 1909. Authority is granted for the return of claimant of copyright. Such copyright disposed are not required by the library. Most film studios routinely still use a photographic with a large format camera working on the set during production, taking pictures for potential publicly used the high-quality photographic paper prints that resulted in some producing quantity for display used by theaters, others in smaller numbers for distributions to newspapers and magazines, and have preserved imagery for any otherwise lost film. In this case, such as London After Midnight, the surviving coverage is so extensive that an entire lost film can be reconstructed scenes from still photographs still have been used to stand for missing footage when making new preserved prints of partially lost films. For example, Gloria Swanson, which was made in 1928. Most lost films are from the silent film and early talkie era, from 1894 to 1930. Martin Scorsese's Film Foundation estimated that 90% of all animated American films were made before 1929 are lost. And the Library of Congress estimated that 75% of all silent films are lost forever. The largest cause of the silent film being lost was the intentional destruction before the era of television and home video. Films were viewed before the era. Films were viewed as having little future value as they were theoretically run, and this similarity silent films were perceived as worthless at the end. After the end of the silent era, film preservationist Robert A. Harris has said most early films did not survive because of wholesale junking by the studio. There was no thought of ever saving these films. They simply needed vault space and the material were expensive to house. Meanwhile, the studios can earn money by recycling the films for their silver content. Mainly Technicolor, 2-color negatives from the 1920s and 30s were thrown out when studios simply refused to reclaim their films. Still being held by the Technicolor and its value, some used prints were sold to scrap dealers and ultimately cut up into short segments for use with small-handed cracked 35mm moving projectors, which were sold as a toy for showing brief excerpts from Hollywood movies at home. Sometimes the destruction was proactive. In 1921, actor Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle was charged with rape and murder of actress Virginia Rapey. Following a series of trials, he was ultimately acquitted. However, by this time, his name had become so toxic that studios engaged in the centrifugal destruction for all films which he had a starring role in. Many other early motion pictures are lost because the narrative film from all 35 mg negatives and prints made before is highly flammable and is very badly deteriorated conditions and improvedly stored, e.g. in the sun basket shed. Narrative films can spontaneously combust. Fires have destroyed entire archives of films. For example, a storage vault fire in 1937 destroyed all original negatives of pure 1935 films by Fox Pictures. The 1965 MGM vault fire resulted in the loss of hundreds more silent films and early talkies. Narrative film is chemically unstable, and over time, they can decay into a sticky mass or powder, aka gunpowder. This process can be very unpredictable. Some narrative films from the 1890s is still in good condition today, while some much narrative had to be scrapped as unsalvageable. It was barely 20 years old. Must depend on the environment in which it's stored. Ideal conditions of low temperature, low humidity, and adequate validation can preserve narrative films for centuries, but in practice, the storage conditions were used for far idle when a film on a narrative is based to say have been preserved, the always means simply that have been copied into a safety film or more recently digitalized. And both methods result in some loss of quality. Esmond Kodak induced a non-flammable 35 mm film stock in spring in 1909. However, the plastic sizers used to make the film flexible evaporated too quickly, making the film dry and brittle, causing sphygmatics to part and preformers to tear. By 1911, the major American film studios were back to using narrative stock. Safety films were regulated to sub minus 35 mm formats such as 16 mm and 8 mm until improvements were made in the late 1940s. Some pre-1931 sound films by Warner Brothers and First National have been lost because they added sound on disc system and separated the soundtrack on special photographic records. And some of the film's soundtrack discs could not be found in the 1950s when 16 mm sounds on reduction prints of early talkies were being made for exclusions in television syndication packets. That film's chance of surviving plummeted. Many sounds on disc films have survived only by the ways of 16 mm prints. As a consequence of this widespread lack of care, the work of early filmmakers and performers, it was made in a way to present only in the fragmented films of a high profile. Example is the case of Tita Barra, one of the most best-known actresses of the silent era. She made 40 films, but only 6 are known to exist.